Thank you so much, Maure and Sepideh, for this invitation. And I'm really happy to be amongst such a great lineup of talks. It looks really exciting. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come to David's talk last week, but I hope that's going to be available because it looked brilliant. So thanks everyone as well for being here. I'm going to present this piece, What is a Face? And it's part of my forthcoming book, Politics, which is a book that grew out of my previous book, and it's a concept that I'm developing, which by the sound of it, you may recognize it. It's grows out of the biopolitical lineage and necropolitics, but it tries to add another dimension to looking at the governance and administration of bodies in a particularly psychoanalytic key. And of course, patio being from the Latin to suffer. So I'm looking particularly at the question of the sexual and the question of enjoyment and suffering as an element in our contemporary modes of governance of bodies and administration of bodies, and what is particular about it in this age of AI and all the other ancillary effects of it that we are faced with at the moment. So this piece that I'm going to give you today is part of this wider project. And so I'm going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we can have a more open discussion. Excuse me. So what is a face? This thing that we believe most uniquely represents our identity, is most belonging to us, yet which is simultaneously inscrutable to us most of the time, unless we are trapped Narcissus-like gazing in a mirror all day. Would it not be more accurate to say that the face belongs entirely to the other? It is for and by the other, constituted in the field of the other. Being creatures of language, the face as our prime means of communication is the ultimate abstraction of signification. This rhapsodic collection of 42 muscles spread out over and around eyes, nose, and mouth work in constant response to the battery of signifiers it encounters. No matter if we're aware of it or not, our faces are speaking for us every minute of the day, with or without words, sounds, or expressions. But of course, faces do not begin as communication machines. In a project for the terraforming research program at the Strelka Institute for Media, Architecture and Design, researchers Abbott, Hue Gonzalez, and Olson present the project Peak Face, in which they state, the facial phase proposes that the terraforming has a period that has been dominated by the face, which began around the Cambrian explosion, around 541 million years ago, and has lasted until now. The face began as an evolutionary adaptation that collected sensory organs at the front ends of animals. From this perspective, the face is primarily a platform for changing the environment and only secondarily an index of human identity. Since the facial phase has a determinate starting date, we can anticipate that it's also going to end at some point in the future. It may even be that we are on the precipice of a post-facial phase of the terraforming, where synthetic abiotic forms of intelligence become key agents of reshaping the surface of the earth, unquote. And it's a fantastic project which presents us with the proposition that we may have indeed reached peak face, and that the terraforming, which originally refers in its classical definition to the hypothetical process of deliberately modifying the atmosphere, temperature, surface, topography, or ecology of a planet, moon, or other bodies to be similar to the environment of Earth or make it habitable for humans. But more specifically, they're using it as to define the process of intelligence transforming its surroundings at the scale of the planet. And that may now be taking a different direction in their view. But we might also turn to Bernard Stiegler's Techniques and Time to identify another evolutionary moment crucial to the development of the human face, that is the acquisition of erect posture. Following paleoanthropologist Leroy Gorin, Stiegler remarks that, contrary to the assumption that a line should be drawn between Homo sapiens via the Neanderthalians with the impressive anthropoid foursome of modern times, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the gibbon, which is the origin of the Neanderthal brain pan and turning point in human paleontology, we should look elsewhere. The determining archaeological element, according to Leroy Gorin, is not directly the development of the brain, but rather the feet, and the discovery of the Zinjanthropian, a man with a very small brain, not a super anthropoid with a large brain pan. This finding, according to Leroy Gorin, necessitates a revision of the concept of the human being, leading him to claim that, to some extent, cerebral development is a secondary criterion. And Stiglitz goes on to say, erect posture determines a new system of relations between these two poles of the anterior field. The freeing of the hand during locomotion is also that of the face from the grasping functions. The hand will necessarily call for tools, movable organs. The tools of the hand will necessarily call for the language of the face. The brain obviously plays a role, but it is no longer directive. It is but a partial element of a total apparatus, even if the evolution of the apparatus tends towards the deployment of the cerebral cortex, unquote. So here we begin to see how the dialectical relation is set up between tools for the hand and language for the face, which in turn Stiglitz famously elaborates in his grand conceptualization of hominization, including memotechnics, exteriorization, and grammatization, in terms of, quote, a unique coupling with the outside, qua epiphylogenetic vector, that is, qua the truth of the inside. In other words, when it comes to the face, not only are we dealing with the evolution of the human species, but with the impossible question of locating the moment when the face became the vehicle of subjectivity per se. So in this talk, I want to explore some aspects of the proposition of the post-facial. Can there ever be a post-facial era, or at least one we could comprehend? With reference to one of Lacan's most famous refrains, just as the letter always arrives at its destination, the face always has an audience, in a sense, cannot exist without one, and vice versa. We as audience need a face to observe and to respond to. We never seem to be able to understand our own faces or reconcile their effect on others, and that's why our faces are usually so problematic for us. In Seminar 10, Lacan asks us to imagine being in front of a female praying mantis and not knowing whether we're wearing the face of a male or a female. Since the female devours the male after mating, the anxiety we would experience is that of not knowing the desire of the other with respect to our own face. This is fundamentally the experience of anxiety of all human encounters. We cannot know what animates the desire of the other, nor what it is that the other sees in us. And the face is a site of deception, both to others and to ourselves, what we appeal to for the truth, yet the locus of our most deeply buried thoughts. The effort we expend each day in preventing the face from exposing us is taken for granted as part of the social contract. In the pornographic image of the usually female face, this anxiety is taken away. The desire is made obvious, unambiguous. The woman's face wants one thing and one thing only. There is no unconscious here, no thought even, just pure affect. It is the insertion of distance that makes the face assimilable, no longer the devouring face of the praying mantis, read mother, which comes in and out of view of the infant's gaze to satisfy all thought demands. The pornographic face has only one meaning. It attempts to communicate nothing new. It always knows its audience and operates in a closed circuit of signifiers. It's no coincidence then that in an age of perpetual anxiety, the general trend in cosmetic surgery and facial modification shares much with the semiotics of the pornographic face, a diminution of facial muscular mobility brought about by Botox, which inhibits the many possible micro-expressions of the face, the augmentation of the lips to a state of permanent suction, and the standardization of features to limit, as far as possible, the polysemic nature of the female gaze. Take the procession of brilliant white, perfectly even tombstone smiles offered by modern dentistry, which often appear to take flight from the mouths of their owners, somewhat like the Cheshire Cat. The enigmatic fascination of the Mona Lisa is no longer coveted. This new smile means the same thing for whomever wears it. Today, the demand is for a permanently youthful face, frozen not just in time, but in the movement of the thought. A face which can enjoy, but cannot think. This must be opposed to the archetype of the male face, which thinks, but should not be seen to enjoy. The face is an existential black hole, both surface and depth. But whilst we used to fall in love with a beautiful image on the usually misguided understanding that what lies beneath is even more fascinating, now the face is an essentially voyeuristic function, both something to be looked at from afar and protected from behind a screen. What lies beneath is of no interest, or at least assumed to be already on the surface. So what of the singularity in the face? How is the face to be located as a site of subjection and freedom? And as I've written about elsewhere in preliminary materials for a theory of the bombshell, which I think was put on the readings for this, I'll just briefly refer to it here. The face, according to Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, in the chapter entitled Year Zero Faciality, is a semiotic system consisting of the white wall and the black hole, or subjectification and signifiance, as they call it. According to Deleuze and Guattari, the face is a product of signifying regimes. They ask, when does the abstract machine of faciality enter into play? When is it triggered? Take some examples. The maternal power operating through the face during nursing, the passional power operating through the face of a loved one, even in caresses, the political power operating through the face of the leader, the power of film operating through the face of the star and the close-up, unquote. Counterintuitively, they argue for a concept of faciality as that which is inhuman on the human body. In fact, they say that the face is not even part of the human body, unlike the head. Quote, it would be an error to proceed as if the face only became inhuman beyond a certain threshold. Close-up, extreme magnification, recondite expression, etc. The inhuman in human beings, that is what the face is from the start. It is by nature a close-up, unquote. This is why in primitive societies, note the anthropological thrust, the head was more privileged than the face, hence the use of masks and other headgear that obscured the facial features. Furthermore, they argue that faciality extends beyond the face and can take up and overcoat the whole body or parts of it. Quote, the entire body can also be facialized, comes to be facialized as part of an inevitable process, when the mouth and nose, but first the eyes, become a holy surface. All the other volumes and cavities of the body follow, an operation worthy of Dr. Maure, horrible and magnificent. Hand, breast, stomach, penis and vagina, thigh, leg and foot, all come to be facialized. Fetishism, erotomania, all are inseparable from these processes of facialization, unquote. The abstract machine of the face, as they put it, is made up of two poles then, the white wall and the black hole. And these two poles also represent the semiotic system of signifiance and subjectification, which they elaborate in relation to the famous body without organs. They say signifiance is never without a white wall upon which it inscribes its signs and redundancies. Subjectification is never without a black hole in which it lodges its consciousness, passion, and redundancies. Since all semiotics are mixed and strata common at least twos, it should come as no surprise that a very special mechanism is situated at their intersection. Oddly enough, it is a face. The white wall black hole system, a broad face with white cheeks, a chalk face with eyes cut out for a black hole, clown head, white clown, moon white mime, angel of death, holy shroud, unquote. So this conception of the face as signifying regime, they eventually want to dismantle, urging us to escape the face. Aside from its foundation as the index upon which racism and sexism are built, i.e. the degree to which any given face differs from the archetypal or sacrificial face, that of Jesus Christ, Deleuze and Guattari seem to want to evade the oppressive function of faciality. But as with many Deleuze or Guattarian concepts, there appears to always be a potential for misapprehension or ambivalence to the direction of their argumentation, which is one way of looking at the desire for standardization of the face so prevalent today, a way to escape the singularity of the face, perhaps, the anxiety-provoking state of affairs which addresses us to the enigma of the other's desire. If we can circumscribe the possible interpretations of our face, then at least we can minimize the possibility of it inducing disapproval, disgust, horror, or rage in the other. Another way to interpret D&G's proposition would be as a particularly masculine viewpoint. In other words, it's easier for men to demand that we escape the face, as they have never really been the victims or accomplices of their own faces in the way that women are. Men can be anonymous facially in a way that a woman can never. Women must be valid, ethical subjects despite their facial conditions, young, old, beautiful, ugly, etc. And this is to say nothing of the racial dimensions of these aspects. Any of those qualifies either helping or hindering her, but never indifferent to her success, happiness, virtue, or moral worth. In this sense, a woman is only ever perceived as her collection of adjectives, which she, of course, knows is not her. Whereas for man, the gap between those descriptors and himself as subject is sutured shut. What he believes he is, he is. This is what led me previously to conclude that the bombshell, as exemplified in the trajectory from Monroe to Kardashian, should be metaphorized into the passage from beauty spot above the mouth to full probe balaclava. Beauty eats itself like a black hole. So what is the function of the face now, if the addressee of our faces is no longer human, but rather a collection of algorithms, which scans our features for certain vectors of likability or consumability? Is it in our interest to confuse or disappoint the audience? It would seem now almost unnecessary that the face as abstracted aesthetic image need to have any connection to its organic evolutionary features. The bilaterian creature who sprang from the Cambrian explosion is one whose existence has been propelled by the forward-facing symmetry most amenable to the survival of the organism. The eyes as light receptors, the mouth as energy consumption and conversion, and the nose as respiratory entrance does no longer need to have any relation to efficacy in order to be beautiful. In fact, it would make sense that these functions be taken up by another part of the body, less devoted to the function of communication. How strange that we should eat, talk, and kiss with the same orifice. It is the proximity of a face and its multiple roles as consuming, communicating, and caressing that can be so monstrous for us to encounter. All the easier to abstract the image from the flesh through the aesthetic dimension of fantasy. The face on screen can be so much less terrifying than the face close up, a face that can look back at us and make us shrivel and cringe with Sartrean self-consciousness. As Lacan pointed out, beauty is a defense against the real. This is not just to be understood as the real of what lies beneath as horrific mass of muscle, sinew, bone, and flesh, but the real as impossible, the impossible point where materiality passes over into abstract signification, where the mouth is both the seductive object of communication and the abyssal entrance to inner and infinite space. Why else is pornography so obsessed with traversing the transitional space of the mouth? It's something to do with the passing over from materiality to transcendence, which happens via the eroticization of the body. But isn't it precisely this nexus of ambivalence and abjection represented by the face as a site of multiple functions, which is the point, and the reason why it may not be so easy to slide into the post-face era? More specifically, the face is not just a site of multiple functions, but simultaneous ontological planes, or in Badiouian terms, truth procedures. The human face can both operate as a purely biological entity, breathing, eating, seeing, hearing, if you include the ears, whilst at the same time as an abstraction machine, signifying, interpreting, desiring, symbolizing. In this sense, there are parallel truth procedures at play, what we could call the temporal and the historical, which affirms the body as mortal and living, and the atemporal and aesthetic, which affirms the subject as undead and enjoying. Another way to understand the significance of these distinctions is in response to the question often posed regarding the possibility of subjectivity in human and artificially intelligent life, which is to say that the subject emerges not via the positing of intelligence, a property which can be attributed to various non-human entities, but rather the juxtaposition of a body in language or sentience. This gives rise to the paradoxical state of affairs that allows the face as abstraction machine to be perceived in any number of inanimate objects through the galaxy, which find themselves imbued with signification. As biological organisms born into language, we become symbolic entities by virtue of having to speak. That's to say, we gain, or better still, appropriate our body, which counterintuitively is a completely symbolic object, via the mediation of language. It's through the conversion of the material bodily utterance into immaterial signs that we become human. The infant scream eventually becomes a word which can never again capture the immediacy of its original meaning. Something is lost, but crucially it's a loss which was never there in the first place, a process which is only ever retroactive. One can never retrieve the moment before the symbolic hit, given that the symbolic is that which allows us to make intelligible the notion of the pre-symbolic extra-linguistic dimension of human existence. The face operates as the Mobius point of encounter of this diachronic moment. Edward Monk's scream is often thought of as capturing the anxiety of the human condition, but in its portrayal of the most basic facial form, it seems to signify not just the pure animal scream of man in nature, but rather something stranger than that, the recognition by nature of the fact of its humanization. Munch famously said of the painting, "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety. And I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature." Unquote. In other words, nature itself becomes facialized, trapped in signification. Unlike the baby who screams because it's not yet able to speak, Munch's scream of nature arises from the horror of discourse, the inescapability of signification which traverses nature and abstracts it from itself, what Lacan would call the second death, the death which occurs paradoxically before death in reality. The second death is the entrance of the living body into the dead realm of the symbolic, forever severing it from the immediacy of the body in space and setting up the infinite and unquenchable cycle of the dry body. Words spilling out of mouths, meanings forever trying to catch up with the utterance from which they emanated. It's rather less then about the face being taken over and made standard by the non-human, and more about the face as a concept which has taken over the non-human and over-determined it. Those clever little eyes, which allowed us to seek out light from the sun, now become the scopic drive whose gaze is turned back a millionfold on the sun and the universe beyond it. This formalized panoptic gaze, which attempts to see everything from all angles and all perspectives at once. The oral drive of the earth, consuming everything in its path, and the invocatory drive of the solar plane, which interprets the enigmatic signifiers all around it. The earth is one big face, addressing an enigmatic other. But to return us back to the core topic of this symposium, that is intelligence unbound, it appears that we have several distinct notions of faciality at stake here, notions which have their corollary in differing concepts of intelligence. In terms of the proposition of the terraforming moment of peak face and our now potentially post-facial era, we could call this the instrumental face, a product of instrumental intelligence, one which follows an evolutionary trajectory and passes through time in a linear chronology, what we could also call deep time. The second notion of faciality, that conceived by Deleuze and Guattari then, is the political face, a product of political intelligence. This is, properly speaking, the historical face of human time, a face which ultimately strives for resistance and escape, striving towards the notions of commons and community. The third form of faciality, and the one which I think is perhaps the only way we can conceive of the face in relation to a notion of the contemporary subject, is what we could call the aesthetic face, a product of aesthetic intelligence. Here we are dealing with a temporal dimension particular to the time of the subject, and that is retroactivity or Mobius time. The aesthetic face, just like the coming into being of a subject, short circuits time. And I'm leaving it there.
Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, they can raise their hands and we will unmute.
Face. So I was thinking of Roland Barthes' The Face of Garbo. Do you know that little essay from Mythologies?
Sure. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering, in the transformation from flight or fight to aesthetics, and then from aesthetics to the politics of gender, do you see forward to eliminate hierarchies in current communication between humans? And then beyond that, to picturing what post-faciality would really look like. So in other words, I'm just using Barth's essay. I'm just using Barth's essay to recapitulate what you've just gone through, and then to get you to imagine what post-faciality might look like.
I think the first bit of your question dropped out a little bit because you said about hierarchies. Can you just repeat what you said, the first bit that you said about eliminating hierarchies? Because I didn't hear that.
So in the contemporary moment, we're faced with the problem of objectification. Mm-hmm. And how do we move past objectification in our embodied response to each other, mm-hmm. to eliminate that hierarchy? How is that possible? And then from that moment, given the psychoanalysis of our traditions, what would post-faciality really entail? And are we talking about a moment completely post-human, without human beings? Or are you talking about a post-faciality with human beings? So in other words, I'm beginning using, I just used the Barth essay mm-hmm. to recapitulate what you just summarized. Mm-hmm. And then wondering how we get past the current constrictions, and then beyond that to a life without faces.
Well, I suppose
I'm gonna have to shut this off because I've got something. I'm shutting myself off so I can put away the food.
Sure. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so my sound is cutting out in and out a little bit, but from what I think I understood from your very interesting points was, I mean, obviously my opening gambit is a semi-response to the fantastic Peak Face project that I mentioned in the beginning, which has a sort of whole different kind of dimension to it than some of the things that, of course, I'm addressing in this particular talk. And I think that my sort of instinct is to say that no, we're certainly not peak, we're certainly not post-face. I don't think we are post-face, but in the sense that you could say the whole sort of formalization of the universe is an attempt to go post-face. And I don't necessarily think that there is a particular watershed moment now that changes the sort of instrumental nature of the way that we are being administered. Particularly, I think that the interesting thing is to think about the face in these various different sort of conceptions, and to try and be specific about what we're talking about when we're talking about faces, because, you know, I think what's so interesting is to look at the sort of simultaneous ways that we can understand the sort of different temporalities at play when thinking about how the faceless as the sort of kind of the onward march of instrumentality, which has suddenly become even more apparent to us in the last sort of couple of decades with artificial intelligence, whether this represents anything particularly new in terms of, you know, a kind of grander evolutionary question of terraforming, whatever. I don't think it's necessarily that's happening at the moment. I think that, you know, this is just a gradual movement that is certainly happening. But what I suppose, obviously, I'm always coming back to is how we can think about the sort of strange retroactivity of the face and the way that we are trying to sort of imagine an outside of the face, but unfortunately we're always brought back down to the question of the subject, and the subject sort of always sort of bursts through in the same way that the face bursts through, in the same way that the face is sort of imbued on all of these other dimensions that we think are sort of so anti-human or so post-human or so non-human, but yet the functions of the face, like for example, you know, thinking about the scopic when it comes to the way that we interact with the scopic drive that we're always on the internet, for example. What is this scopic drive, and how does it relate to faces? Because faces aren't just about, you know, two eyes, a nose and a mouth, that they're functions that happen to coalesce around a particular physical constellation, but actually the function of faces have a much more different and scary kind of resonance for us as human beings, as does the mouth. And I think what I'm interested in is sort of like opening up how we can think about these elements of the face as drives that also exist in non-human form. You know, oral drive, invocatory drive, these are drives that you don't have to have an actual biological human body to exist. And therefore, I think psychoanalysis gives us a way of thinking about the drives, which is already inherently post-human in the sense that it doesn't have to take this kind of traditional understanding of the human as a sort of living entity. So with that, I suppose I'd say I don't know and what's going to happen, but I definitely think that it's something that needs to be thought, and it's a really kind of rich territory to sort of unpack.
Thank you. That was really a deep answer. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that John has the next question, if you'd like to speak.
Sure. Brilliant. So thank you very much for your talk. So my question then pertains to one point that you had brought up in your talk, around 2/3. This idea of the blending of jobs was really potent to me. The idea of kind of culminating these different sort of disparate functions, and yet sort of ignoring one or the other in the processing of a face. So I study music. So my question pertains to culture and music. What are the implications for popular culture in this sort of post-face realm? I was thinking about, you know, cultural production depends on a face in a way. It depends on sort of reading the person. How can you develop a culture without sort of, or maybe not so much culture, but sort of cultural capital, let's say, without a face? What does sort of post-face cultural production look like? And in terms of music making, you know, there are non-human music making, you know, people make beats all the time and it's not necessarily connected to a person. But usually it's always dependent upon an identity that the music is attached to, whether you're in, you know, you're in performance, there's a DJ, or there's some sort of real person. Even if you are using AI, there's still a face to the, you know, the machine. So what does sort of culture production, music making, live music making, cultural production look like in a sort of post-face universe? And can cultural production exist without a face? That's my question. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, my sort of short answer would be say, I think it already does. I think that a lot of the sort of old fuddy-duddy complaints, like I have myself, about rubbish, you know, mass-produced music, is basically the question of music without a face. But what does that actually mean? It means music that doesn't properly get produced from an artist making something that they have genuinely had a connection to, but rather a mass-produced collection of audience, you know, interests that have then been fed through an algorithm in order to produce the next girl group or boy group or whatever. And you know, that's a process that's been going on for a very long time. And you know, people like Adorno were moaning about it already with various problems, obviously, to his standpoint. But the fact is that we already have this going on in culture, sort of facelessness. I mean, but what does that mean? Because it's easy to say, oh, it's faceless in the sense that it's a corporation or it's bureaucracy. Yes, but does facelessness mean there are no individual people connected to their work, or does it mean that it's very much more difficult for a face to come into being, i.e. an authentic subject, to be able to produce work? And I suppose that's what you're interested in as an artist and, you know, a person thinking about culture, that you want to know whether it's possible. I think that's what we all are sort of kind of worried about, isn't it? Is can we produce authentic pieces of work, whether it's our thought or our music or dance or paintings? And I think that the sort of general facelessness on the cultural level is certainly a fear that there are certain sort of impulses that are pushing the production of culture that can be said to be faceless. But I think they already are here, and I think they will get worse. But there is also so many other factors in the sort of production of new forms of music and new art, for example, that owe themselves to a whole different kind of genres of technology, which again can't simply be put down to something taken away from the human, or taken away, this sort of very old-fashioned idea of thinking about humans being connected to actual tools, you know, actual physical tools. Of course, we are using technologies in different ways, and are those technologies still able to allow us to be subjectively connected to that piece of work, is, I suppose, the question that we need to ask.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking, just a very quick comment, but this sort of breakdown of the imaginary, and I think you were talking about that in terms of pornography too, the sort of very superficial reading that doesn't take much to infer what the meaning is, versus something that can be construed in multiple different ways, and that you create your own meaning, and then when you come to it, you know, you're proven wrong, and it's somehow less pleasurable in a way.
Yeah,
somehow.
I mean that's something, you know, I think is particular about the pornographic, which I was sort of getting at, is this sort of diminishing of semiotics, as opposed to sort of opening up, you know, rather than to critique pornography on the basis of obscenity or you know, being bad for women or bad, you know, what about the question of the sort of the kind of removal of nuance, the removal of signification that happens when you have a medium that basically reduces human interaction to a very standardized way of understanding somebody? And the face in pornography has a very particular function in that sense, in that it kind of like simplifies the face. It gives it one particular objective, which is interesting to think about, the sort of the pornification of lots of other mediums, which is apparent not just in actual pornography, but happens through other forms of cultural production.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that the next question came from Vyacheslav.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. I'm actually currently reading The Machinic Unconscious by Deleuze and Guattari, and he has like their quite intense essay on the faciality. And I was just to make sure I understand correctly that post-facial kind of future means that it's faceless, right? And if yes, I mean, as I understood in Guattari's essay and also in A Thousand Plateaus, like the idea of faciality deeply connected to the idea of the redundancies. Redundancies are by itself, in Deleuze and Guattari's like discourse, they basically, they are something that through which we have giving some sort of idea of irreducibility of something. So basically through faciality, for example, the despot like making his own appearance as if he was God, like irreducible, like unkillable, and stuff. And I was just wondering if we will come, like fully speculating, right? If we will come to the like this point of the facelessness, there will be no, there will be no like redundancies, there will be no like this kind of irreducibilities. So basically, I think that we would come like, I want to think that we would come like to the world where everything's possible. I guess like there is nothing irreducible, so basically everything goes. That's like my interpretation or like speculation. I don't know what you think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, with obviously the year zero faciality essay from Deleuze and Guattari, this idea of the sort of eventual probe head that they sort of imagine, it's difficult to sort of to see how this translates in, you know, yes, the kind of universality that we could say would be the political gesture of bringing everybody towards this zero level of equality through escaping the face. But I think it's a very difficult proposition, and I'm not sure how it translates. And I think what's interesting about it is that it kind of exemplifies some of the ways that Deleuze and Guattari have this ability to sort of go in both directions and can be appropriated to sort of quite sort of contradictory ends. That obviously we know obvious examples of when that can happen, like Nick Land, for example. But so this sort of accelerationist impulse to go beyond and accelerate to the point that we don't have any of these kind of petty ideas about human beings anymore, because, you know, these are sort of useless to us and redundant. I sort of think they kind of trip themselves up, because you kind of miss some of the most sort of basic things about the sort of basic function of faciality. And I don't think that essentially, I don't think that we can escape the face. And I think that as long as we're having these kinds of discussions, we're always going to be locked into faciality. I don't think politics can happen without faciality. And I think the question of faciality is really the question of the universal and the singular. And I think it's quite interesting, because the thing about the face is that it kind of operates on this strange plane that sort of passes between the universal and the singular all the time. And that's why it's such a fascinating concept, because it sort of brings us into view how you can have the sort of eternal symbolic and the sort of material everyday in this one sort of lump of meat, as it were. And that's why the face is just such a sort of sacred object in art. And, you know, it always is drawing us back to some idea of transcendence, because there's something there that about the face that represents this sort of singular and universal question at the same time. So I don't know if that touches on your question, but
yeah, thank you.
There was a question from the chat from Claire. If they want to speak, that's possible, or I can alternately read it out loud. The chat comment says, "Great talk. I wonder about the relationship between the hand and the face, hands being also a way to use language." I think that's referring to the consideration of tools for the hand, language for the face.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's so crucial about Stigler's work, obviously, is that the kind of the recognition that we can't just talk about technology at any point in evolution as a discrete thing that happened to humans. And neither can we do that now with artificial intelligence as this thing happening to humans. You know, to understand something like on the grand scale of the evolution of the human being, to understand that something as sort of material as the releasing of the face from the hands from the face, so that, you know, once the human beings got up on their back legs, as it were, this changed the whole evolution of the subject as well as just their physical being, because it wasn't even just about the brain. That was the point, you know, he was interested in, is that it, whilst we thought it was to do with this particular coagulation of species which had a bigger brain pan, this was not actually the main factor driving it. It was really to do with something as physical as the releasing of the hands. So this sort of principle, you know, this is happening all the time in every moment of human evolution. And of course, that's a particular discrete moment. But now, when we're thinking about the face in relation to the technologies that we have and that we're going to continue to have, they're so intricate and complex, the types of interaction that we have to think about, the forms of memotechnics and exteriorization, and how these new technologies change the possible direction of what we can possibly do and what we are able to do as a species. This is just one way of kind of understanding it. It's sort of a metaphor in a way. I mean, it's true, but it's also metaphorical to understand the release of the hands as a sort of thing that can also have, you know, we can think about now in terms of our current situation.
Thank you. I think Renzo was the next to raise their hand.
Thank you very much, Maure. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Isabel. Very interesting talk. I was thinking while I listened to you, the aspect of another notion from Deleuze, that is the notion of the individual, on the facialization in the platform nowadays with algorithmical aspect, no? How compose more than divide faces, no? Profilization of the faces, especially now with all these filters that we have, no? That we can co-constitute with algorithmic many other faces, no? In the sense, I was thinking the stuff from Plato that he say, let's say, a head's including the body, but not a face, no? Remind me that when I saw these many faces interacting between in this algorithmical aspect in this platform, no? Does these two faces or more than two faces in the profile, how do you see this individual and individual composition, no? Active in this scope of relations with the technology, you know, that is, as I say, more a composition than more a division, no? A division of something. It's more entanglement in the sense, no? This entanglement of individual and individual, no? And at the same time, it's involved in individual process with algorithm, you know, that is constitute this economical, political, biological aspects with us in this interaction. No? This is my question. Thank you very much, Isabel, again.
Thank you. The sound is quite difficult, but I think if I understand you well, yeah, that you're referring to the process of individualization and exactly how that applies to faciality, and the way that the different sort of institutions.
Yes, that is for me more a post phase in that. When you mentioned the notion of post phase, I for me more coming this individual aspects of post phase that is more algorithmically and biologically, you know, inorganic and organic at the same time in this composition of post phase in these filters, no? When I heard you about this notion of post phase.
Well, I suppose the salient point is that the sort of, if we think about individualization as the sort of carving up into different elements of data that we all represent, we all kind of walk around being parts of, either the bank's knowledge of us, or the hospital's knowledge of us, or the electoral register's knowledge of us, or whatever. And then essentially that's all we are, is just nodes of information. That obviously the face represents a kind of suturing point of all of those pieces of information, and an extremely useful resource in terms of capitalism. I mean, being able to have our facial data is extremely valuable, and something that we give away so easily, and we have already given away. I mean, it's not even that we can't go back anymore to a sort of ownership of our face, because as soon as we started having phones and using apps, all of that data got sucked away. So who knows to what extent our facial data is already being used against us. And of course, we all know the sorts of people who are going to be more targeted by those kinds of technologies, and all the injustices that will result through that, the wielding of those technologies. But I certainly think that this information is going to become more and more complex, and then that question does come in again of to what extent is it in our interest to evade these technologies? To what extent is it not a question of kind of like holding back the sort of onslaught of facial modification and being sort of conservative about it, and rather saying, well, actually, no, scramble the face, lose the face, don't let the face anymore be something that can be appropriated. But because, of course, we don't have ownership over our image, do we? I mean, our face is all over everywhere and can be used for any purpose that they want. So it's a very difficult question, and one that I think is only going to get more difficult.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. Felipe has a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Maure. Thank you, Sepideh, for organizing this. And sorry about this, folks, but hi, Carl. Glad to see you here. Thank you, Isabel. And I'm sorry if this is going to be a bit too long. Because it was very funny for me to listen to your talk as someone who has great trouble in mixing visual inputs of a face and listening to someone talk. So for me, there is already some facelessness at play in everyday experience, and added to that, I would like to just comment on John's question and your reply to his question, that I think there is already a lot of facelessness in cultural production, given, for example, take academic cultural production. We read each other's papers, and that's it. Well, we can go to conferences and do these talks as well, but mainly it's faceless. Which leads me to my question, and I have to do a bit of an exposition. Maybe you're familiar with this, but still, I was listening to you and thinking of a pedagogical and psychological experiment with which Evald Ilyenkov, a Soviet philosopher, was involved with in the early 70s, I think, in Soviet Russia, where looking for a way to enable political emancipation from people who were to date excluded from it, people born only with senses of touch and smell at the exclusion of three others, and looking for a way to put the universal and the particular at interplay in those persons. They, Meshcheryakov, if I'm pronouncing his name well, and Ilyenkov, they developed a pedagogical framework to bring out the human in these persons, to turn them into rational, self-determining agents. And so we're talking about persons for whom the face is at the scale of smell and touch, but nonetheless, people who became able to navigate the world without the face, as most of us do. So, and apologies if this sounds like disagreement, but it's polite disagreement. When you said, and I think I understood you well, that there is no politics without faciality, does this go all the way, or the Meshcherekov-Vilyankov pedagogical experiment shows us a path which includes partial facelessness? I hope this made some sense, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Well, I mean, I know I didn't say there's no politics without faciality, actually, but what I did say was that I think, well, certainly in the course of the paper, we're talking about different sort of notions of faciality that correspond to different notions of intelligence, and which I sort of would call instrumental, political, and aesthetic. And I think that the point is to kind of be aware of when we're transitioning between those different elements and what they mean in relation to each other, because I think political intelligence necessarily, you're talking about the idea of being able to recognize people through things other than the face and being able to identify an individual, but this also pertains to the notion of the commons, the notion of being able to strategize for the good of a group of people, which is another way of saying politics. So can that be faceless? Well, in a sense, faceless in the sense that it's universal, yes. Doesn't matter about which face it is. The point about politics is that all of the faces are the same, essentially, under politics, because we all are for the same purpose. We all want the same thing, i.e. the good of the polis, as opposed to the aesthetic or the sort of psychoanalytic question of the face, which is one that has slightly less interest in the commons. And in fact, it has less interest in the preservation of itself, because I think the one thing that has to be distinguished between the political intelligence and the aesthetic intelligence in terms of why it's distinct is because the aesthetic intelligence is the one which most kind of typifies the psychoanalytic subject. And the psychoanalytic subject is one who does not try to preserve itself. In fact, what it tries to do is destroy itself most of the time. And its interest is not politics. Its interest is not the community, bringing everyone together. It's actually one that is quite self-destructive. So I think in terms of the face, this is a function that the face has simultaneously. And this is what I was quite interested in to think about, how these transitions that exist at the same time within the same person, but yet they have different objectives, and we all kind of have those objectives within us in our own understandings of the face, if that makes sense, the distinction I'm trying to make here. Because I think the thing about sort of a psychoanalytic subjectivity that I think is always worth throwing into the ring is just this idea of not doing something in your interest. We generally don't do things that are in our interests. Psychoanalytically, we do things because we enjoy them, because they give us something beyond life. That's essentially the problem with being human. So I hope that kind of addresses what you were getting at.
Felipe, you're muted if you're making a comment. If not, Carl has a question.
Hello, nice to see you, Isabel. I have a couple of questions. I really enjoyed your talk. It was nice. One of the things I wonder about is the kind of this distinction, particular and universal, and I wonder in particular why this is kind of the chosen tension. It seems to me that there is something That is, well, before I say that, I guess one of the things that's so interesting about the face is that everyone has one. And that there are so many ways in which we can talk about faces. We have sort of different kind of registers. There's a kind of the biological register, there's the kind of the symbolic register, and so we can kind of, they're not necessarily kind of coextensive in terms of what they actually refer to, which is another kind of interesting thing. There's some kind of slippage in the one discourse about the face compared to another one. But one of the things I wonder about is kind of the whether or not you think that kind of talking about the face as a tension between the particular and the generic, as it's kind of pertaining to kind of a genus, right, might also be kind of fruitful compared to kind of too quickly landing in the universal. Because if we're talking about the face as something that is generic and kind of has a tension with the particular, then there is sort of then there's a kind of a conceivability of escaping the face in a different way, and not only in this kind of a biological evolutionary sense, but perhaps also as a kind of functionally, as a kind of generic or kind of a certain constraint on how. On interfaces in general, right? So that the kind of the human face is almost like a particular constraint or generic constraint on how it is possible to interface or two different entities can kind of interact through something. And yes, sorry, I don't want to go on too much, but I wonder about this kind of tension. Obviously, I've thought about similar issues quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I'm not. Can you just exactly pinpoint what the question is? Because I'm not quite sure how to respond.
No. Sorry. I think why do you kind of land in the tension, particular contra universal, when you're talking about the face, and sort of what you think is where is the? I'm not saying that it's not there, but I wonder where you find the universal, because I understand the face in its particularity, but its universality is slightly frightening almost to me. That's sort of right.
Okay. Well, I mean, I suppose obviously the immediate thing is if we're thinking about the political and the psychoanalytic, then we have to think about the sort of singular and the universal. That's it's always there, and we have to find a way of mediating that relationship. But I mean, surely the face, the point about the face is that it has this universalizing capacity in that we can recognize a face in anything, and the sort of function of the face is something that is so kind of hardwired into us that we see it, in inanimate objects, and it does something to us. And as we know, there are people who neurologically lose the capacity to recognize faces, and that's very distressing, and brings with it all these other difficulties, but opens up lots of really interesting philosophical questions. And I think it's so interesting to think about how these very small differences in faces can open up this whole realm of the uncanny, and the whole realm of sort of abjection and horror that can come about with the smallest change of a face, or the sort of, or the over symmetricalization, for example, of a human face. The perfectibility of the face that becomes sort of monstrous when you sort of take out the sort of contingency of irregularities, etc., and so that this sort of question of the sort of vectors of universality and particularity are very interesting when you think about how we relate ourselves as racially to other people, or in terms of gender, in terms of recognizing people's or identifying people as a certain gender or sex, which of course, as we know, is something that is extremely fraught and causes a lot of discord and horror amongst people, and the ways that certain people are not able to cope with the understanding of presenting a face that isn't the thing that you think it is. And this kind of idea of what we consider to be the universal about the face is very problematic, because the slightest change to what we consider as a shared factor can suddenly create a whole sort of onslaught of other effects. So I mean, in terms of the question of universality, I mean, standardization is one way, another way of thinking about universality, which has a very monstrous side to it. And I think one of the elements of standardization that I was also interested in is talking about is, of course, cosmetic surgery, and the fact that more and more younger people are thinking that their faces are not okay, and they need to change them, they need to become standardized. And the sort of effects of this that can be witnessed, for example, in the sort of Instaface of the young girls with particular features that are all the same. You could say, oh, this is emancipation, this is women doing what they want to do, or people doing what they want to do, and what's wrong with that? But of course, as we know, our wants and desires are not all down to our own powers. They're imposed upon us. So to what degree what we do to ourselves physically and what we're made to think we need to do facially is a question of the sort of reaching towards the universal in a sort of emancipatory way, and to what degree it's a sort of oppressive standardizing and a sort of leveling out of all sort of individual subjective contingencies is another question. I don't know if that is at all approaching the kind of question that you were asking me.
I mean, yes and no. I can kind of see what you're saying, and I think we were kind of talking about universality in slightly different senses. But I'm going to write an email to you after this, because I think there's a really kind of interesting question here, and I want to
please do
talk more about this.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Cheers.
Another question by Martin, if you'd like to ask.
Why don't you let Moises go first, because he hasn't had a chance.
Okay, Moises.
So I'll be happy to go.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel, and everyone. I want to go back to like governance, or I wrote down machinic governance, but the distinction would be like a correspondence between face and voice and obedience. And I was also making connections to like the facelessness of God, and or how God becomes voice or text, and behavior corresponds to that. But I was just thinking, if a possible obedience to a faceless authority, it would have to be in the shape of a mirror. So like the members of the polis would have to see themselves in the command, and but then I guess it comes back to the subject. I don't know. I'm a little lost of what I'm trying to say, but there is something about like the super intelligence is faceless, and yeah, I don't know. I have written down philosopher king is a machine, or should be a machine, or should be an algorithm, and whether if it's a beautiful algorithm, I guess it will come back to how beautiful the self is to the self. I'm not sure if that's a question, but these are ideas that were provoked by. I didn't fully finish reading the faciality chapter, but command and power and governance all blend in together for me. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting. There's really interesting points you're bringing up, and what it immediately makes me think about is obviously the relationship between the invocatory and the face. And you're talking about the word of God or the voice of God, and of course we're more fundamental to look at the relationship between the face and the voice and their relationship psychologically than in theology and religion. And the religions which, for example, prohibit the depiction of God or the face of God, there is a reason why. Why do they do that? Why is there some difficulty in seeing God but not hearing? That's interesting, isn't it? What is it about the invocatory that commands this fear that doesn't need to have a face? Or is the facelessness of it more intimidating if you put it into the form of the human? And it's difficult to come up with a quick answer to that, but it certainly suggests that the function of the invocatory is something that can be severed from the face, yet the fact that you can't depict the face means that there's a very serious reason why. Why can't you? Why should it be prohibited? If you are hearing the voice of God, why can't you see the face? So this sort of the desire to hide, the desire to obscure, is something particular to the face, because it exposes us, isn't it? It exposes something. And I don't know what the connection is, but I think the point about the invocatory is it's something that can exist outside the material, and it can penetrate without actual real sound. When you have oral hallucinations, for example, there doesn't actually need to be a physical, measurable, scientific thing that is the sound. That you're just hearing the sound, it's there, but it's not anywhere. It's not a real thing that exists. So there's this sort of immateriality about the voice, even though it has to sort of stem from the vocal. And it's just this very strange sort of passage through this sort of transcendent passage that happens. But that just, sorry, that you made me think of that when you were talking about those points. So I hope that kind of responds to you and what you were saying.
Thank you. Yes, it has the new things to think about.
Can I ask a question before Martin? If that's okay with you, Martin? I would like to ask a question.
Certainly.
I was thinking when I lose someone that I love, I like to look at pictures of their faces, and I was interested in the way that the face can be used to integrate loss without identifying with that loss, as a way of revisiting the faceless through the face and circulating like trauma that way. So I was just wondering, I remember you said the face as a heuristic function, but then I was wondering if there's another face that's not an appearance or not representable, more like potential for expression or morphology of emotions. And it made me think then of Buster Keaton, the actor, who sometimes people call it a stone face or a poker face. But that Buster Keaton's face always seemed extremely emotional to me. And so I was wondering if this, you're suggesting thinking of face in terms of drives, if that's like another face, or if there are other ways of having a more perverse relationship with faces that you've found through Patty politics.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting what you say about Buster Keaton and sort of the idea that, like, if you supposedly are inhibiting your expressions, it's that you can't read anything. But as you say, like, actually you don't have to have a sort of extreme sort of use of facial expressions to be able to communicate deep emotions or thoughts. And often the best actors are people who don't particularly do anything very particularly over the top with their faces, and usually what the ones that do are more comic actors, like Jim Carrey, for example. But the sort of strange paradoxical thing about the face as being this sort of tool for dissimulation, and the sort of kind of stoicness of the face as being able to both transmit emotion but also hold back emotion, and give the person who you're interacting with the whatever whatever sort of degree of sensitivity that you need to show them. And that's what's very interesting about, you know, people who are particularly skilled at communicating know how to have their face when they're in communication with other people, how much to respond to every little thing that somebody says, how much to keep composed, and you know, this sort of like back and forth that the face has to do all the time is actually quite a skilled job, and why very good actors are so impressive, and why, for example, screen acting and theatre acting are so very different in terms of what demands they make of the face. But yeah, so back to the notion of sort of using a face to be able to sort of work through emotions as well, and loss and grief. I think it's true that it's probably easier to do that via the face than probably the voice, and I certainly would feel more would find it more difficult to listen to voices of people who I've lost than to look at their faces. It's much more immediately evocative and emotive that when you hear a voice and when you see a face. So maybe they sort of function in very different ways in terms of bringing the subject to bear.
Thank you so much. That's really important for me. I'll let Martin ask another question.
Hi, Isabel. This is a meta question concerning people who are trying to do transdisciplinary work. I'm really interested in the role of metaphor, tropes generally in a transdisciplinary inquiry. And I'm also interested in neuroscience. And so one could think of the problem of the face as the problem of metonymy, because that the face is instrumental. From the point of view of neuroscience, large sections of the brain are involved in both interpreting faces and also in manipulating the face to be either read or misread by the other. But it's also a synecdoche for embodiment itself. In that every issue that you've raised with respect to faciality can be applied at a more abstract level to the problem of embodiment. And I'm wondering what you think of the unstable relationship between metonymy and synecdoche here. That the face is a synecdoche for embodiment, but it's also metonymy because of its instrumental function. And whether that raises problems for you in performing transdisciplinary inquiry.
Well, if I understand your question, it was a really fascinating way of putting it. So the synecdoche of the face, as sort of, in what sense is metonymy and synecdoche different in this sense? Because if the part standing in for the whole,
synecdoche is part of a whole relation. Yeah, so synecdoche is part of whole relationship. Metonymy is
you mean the sliding of meaning
a reference
different
to, right, but it can also refer to a functional relationship. For example, a sail can be both a synecdoche for boat, but also a reference to its function.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. So if I could leave it there, and given that this is a meta question about how we do transdisciplinary inquiry, so I'm wondering whether you see that the oscillating relationship between synecdoche and metonymy raises problems for interpreting the face.
Yes, I would say it definitely does. And I think my sort of solution, whether it's a solution or not, or my way of handling that is to identify the different types of face when we're talking about different types of face, i.e. the instrumental, the political, the aesthetic. And, these are just my own sort of conceptualizations. Other people may want to differ in that particular wording, but what I suppose from the sort of piece of work that I've so far done on this is what I'm interested in is sort of the relationship between different ways of understanding the face, but also the ways of connecting that to different concepts of intelligence per se, because of course the concept of intelligence is one that kind of I'm interested in and have been interested in since the beginning of my research, and how that it's a sort of very slippery concept that is different depending on what discipline you're talking, whether it's neuroscience or psychoanalysis or philosophy or cognitive science, etc., etc. And so of course I've always been interested in trying to understand how we're using the concept of intelligence when we're using it, and so likewise, for the concept of the face, to be able to tie it to specific types of intelligence is important. And hence I think the question of the sort of peak face question, the terraforming question, this is one that most closely aligns to me with the notion of the instrumental and the face as an instrument, and indeed a sort of synecdoche for the body as well. When it comes to thinking about the political face, this again has a different relationship to the body, and one which asks us to sort of conceive of the face in another sort of temporality. And again, then when we come to the aesthetic face, this has the temporality of psychoanalysis. So if we think about the temporalities as being deep time, instrumental face, sort of historical time, political face, and subjective time, aesthetic face. So those three times, deep, historical, and aesthetic, are times which kind of operate alongside each other in a way. And I mean, when I say historical time, I mean the time of the human species, insofar as we can think about it as a species that identifies itself as being political. Where that begins and ends is obviously up for debate. But of course, those three times I think are important to kind of hang on to in all these discussions about the face and the possibility of the post-facial or peak face, or all these other very interesting terms that the beginning research that I referred to was talking about. So yes, to answer your question, it is complicated, and I think that when doing interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, it's a question of identifying concepts and trying to understand how they work alongside each other, and coming up with sort of coherent or consistent ways of distinguishing them, if that gets to your point at all.
Yeah, it's a hobby horse of mine to focus on a paradox in Deleuze, where he says he exhorts us to forge alliances across scientific functions or percepts, philosophical concepts, and artistic constructions. But then he denies the efficacy of metaphor because of its taint by representation and capital B being, But I've been trying to force the issue by saying that tropes generally are irreducible. And so I wanted to use tropes to illustrate how unstable these alliances can be. And I really appreciated your answer there. I thought that was really good. And I find this whole project really wonderful. I also loved the way you're using the term terraforming here, which is, I think, perfect for the larger scope sense of the progress of history here. I think that was really good.
Thank you.
So
Cheers.
thanks. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions, or would anyone else like to speak at all? You're welcome to. I'll say that I love the book, The Psychoanalysis of AI, and when I heard about the petty politics, I thought that was so mysterious, and now I have a better idea of where that's going. But if I may ask, could you speak more generally about the theory of petty politics? Is this question of the face central to it, or if there's anything more that you could say for contextualizing in the theory of petty politics? I'm very interested. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so petty politics, well, it was a concept that emerged in the psychoanalysis of AI as a sort of way of trying to think about what types of problems emerge when you have the possibility of creating artificial forms of life, and on the other hand, how human beings interact with artificial forms of life. And of course, in the sort of sci-fi realm of films that depict what we end up doing when we're faced with cyborgs or replicants, etc., etc., and of course all the lineage of those films that completely exposes all of our worst instincts as human beings and our desires to abuse and torture other life forms or our own life form. So I was interested in thinking about the governance of bodies. I was thinking about biopolitics. I was thinking about the necropolitical, and I was thinking about what happens when you take the kind of the canto vexade of Lacan, the idea of the sort of the being that cannot possibly find a answer to its desire, and it has to keep going beyond and beyond to the nth degree in order to try and obtain this moment of enjoyment. When you apply that to the sort of bombastic questions of human augmentation and all of the discourses around artificial intelligence and non-human life, and that was the sort of concept that came to me to try and articulate these new problems. And it's not just about managing bios, not just managing life or biology or biological life. It's not just about managing death in the sort of Membian notion of sort of concentration camps or large scale human tragedies and war zones, but it's also about how we are managing human drives, how we're managing sexuality, how we're managing suffering, how we're managing our own enjoyment as a species, and one which has got to the point where we're very, very adept at manipulating our bodies and our desires. And when you pass over, I mean, of course, we have lots of images of that in science fiction, but we also now start to see all these sort of small kinds of emergencies of these these sort of phenomena in our everyday lives. And whether that's to do with our sexual relationships or to do with our relationship to our own bodies or our relationship to politics in general, Patriarchal is interested in trying to understand how this works, and in what ways that we can think about the governance of bodies when it comes to this sort of undead realm, this sort of realm that, of course, in psychoanalytic terms is sexual, but it doesn't necessarily mean actual sex in the sense of, you know, pornography or sexual interaction, but just acknowledging the fact that subjectivity and sexuality are bound as one, and that we're in a situation where it's becoming more and more complex, the ways in which that operates. So the book is you know, faciality is one aspect of it, but it's among many other elements that I'm sort of drawing in, and it's of course psychoanalysis and Lacan, but it's also Baudrillard and Badiou and Adorno and Lyotard and lots of French thinkers and Barthes as well, and people helping me to sort of articulate some of the new problems that I think we have to think about in this age that we're in.
Thank you. That's very exciting. Again, I'll open it up if anyone else has anything else that they'd like to ask or say. Or if you have any other comments that you would like to make, Isabel, for anything like a conclusion.
Oh, just to say, I'm really thrilled that everyone is here, and all the comments and questions have been really fantastic and so helpful to me as well. And Carl Olsen, who obviously wrote part and made part of the research that I was talking about earlier. That's fantastic that he was here as well, and I'm very excited to hear all of your responses, so thank you. And I'm sure it's going to help me develop my ideas as well in the book as it goes forward.